Hello everyone, welcome back to the European Conference of Science Journalism in Trieste and everywhere else. We now pass to the topic that was probably partially silenced by the pandemic, but not because it became less important. Climate change will be with us probably hopefully much longer than coronavirus, and it remains a big challenge for science journalists to report on that topic. And today with us we have Leo Hickman, the founder of Carbon Brief, that will share his experience and views on climate change reporting. You're very welcome, Leo. The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you very much, Alexandra, and thank you very much for inviting me today to speak at the ECSJ conference in Trieste. I know I appreciate most of us are probably joining virtually, but it's a great honor and taking part. So I'm going to, I think I've got about half an hour, but that includes some question and answer time with the audience, which is fine. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring up a PowerPoint and do a fairly quick talk through my own experience of reporting climate change and also observing how the media more generally reports on climate change. So if I try and share my screen, hold on one second. Let's see if this works. So maybe give me the thumbs up. Yeah, is that working? Yeah, okay, great. So just to start at the very beginning, my name is Leo Hickman and I edit a website which is based in the UK called Carbon Brief, and I've been doing this since early 2015, so yeah, about 5 years. But Carbon Brief actually launched in early 2011, so we're coming up to our 10-year anniversary of Carbon Brief. And this is just to give you a little screenshot of our homepage today, just to give you a little flavor of kind of some of the things and types of ways that we cover climate change. So broadly, we split pretty equally between science and policy. So we have a team of 2 journalists who are writing around climate science, the latest climate science to be published, and also what we've come to be really known for is what we call explainer journalism. So really kind of long tail pieces, big features that explain some of the key issues in climate science and really should be kind of almost timeless. So they may be pieces that we spend many months, sometimes even up to a year, sometimes researching and writing, and then they will be published and then will be available for, forevermore, really, in terms of people looking for it on Google. And then we also have a policy team of 2 writers as well. And typically what we do within that team is we explain kind of national policy. So what the UK is doing, what the US, India, China, the EU, etc. And also at the international level. So like the Paris Agreement is obviously very important for our audience, and explaining the latest developments in terms of that. And also we publish a lot around energy policy. So we explain electricity generation around the world through coal, gas, renewables, nuclear, etc. And to a lesser degree, maybe we report on things like transport, mobility, housing, buildings, heavy industry, etc. We also have a couple of satellite writers. We have someone based in San Francisco who writes about climate science, who is actually a climate scientist himself. And we also have someone in Finland who writes around emission trends. And that's been very important for us this year, writing around the impact that the COVID pandemic has had on emission trends. So that's a little bit of background around Carbon Brief. I will come on in the second part of the talk to talk specifically about the type of journalism that we produce and the reasons why we produce that at Carbon Brief. But first of all, I just wanted to give a little sense of my own perspective of reporting around climate change. So I've been a journalist, 20, 25 years, I guess. I was at The Guardian in London for about 16 years as a general feature writer and editor. But in the last 10 years of that time, I was mainly focused on writing about climate change. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back in time quite quickly and go through some sort of my observations around climate change and how the media has covered it. There's obviously going to be a bit of a kind of UK bias to what I'm talking about, because that is my direct experience. But you know, I'll try and broaden out as well. So this is the Times newspaper in London, kind of the key establishment paper in the UK, reporting in May of 1990, and this was their front page story on the day that the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, produced its first scientific assessment of climate change. A really kind of key landmark moment, I guess, in the history of climate change, but particularly around how the media reports climate change. So we see Margaret Thatcher, who was just at the end of her time as Prime Minister, opening the Hadley Centre, a very important climate research centre in the UK, in the picture in the centre. But also over here on the left-hand side, the main story is about the reaction of policymakers, i.e. Margaret Thatcher, to the report of the first IPCC report. So already we're seeing, right from the early days of reporting around the scientific consensus and view of what climate change is and what's causing climate change, we already have the sense that policymakers are absorbing that and reacting to that. If you skip forward like 20 years, this is December 2009. This is the Daily Express, one of the key tabloids in newspapers in the UK. And you'll notice a very, very different front page. So we have 100 reasons why global warming is natural, quote, no proof that human activity is to blame. So this is particularly symptomatic of the UK's, I would argue, the Anglosphere's media reporting of climate change over the last 2 to 3 decades. So by Anglosphere, I mean kind of the UK, US, and probably Australia as well. And there has been, I would argue, a very disproportionate sense that the climate skeptics, people who doubt the science, have been given equal weighting often in many newspapers, and often many right-wing leaning newspapers. And this has distorted and warped, I think, the scientific coverage and arguably accuracy, well, not arguably, definitely accuracy around climate science. So this is to give a context of why I think there's this big, there's this big issue really in the reporting of climate science. Also notice the date, that's important. So December 2009, many of you will remember that was right at the very end of the Copenhagen Climate Summit, the one that was perceived to have failed. So that was important. So the media trying to set the agenda for those talks. Then we come forward again and we come to 2018, so 2 summers ago, when there was a big, big heat wave across many parts of the Northern Hemisphere. And again, The Sun, this is probably one of the leading tabloid newspaper in the UK. And a very, very striking front page, probably very memorable. The world's on fire, reporting around the fires in Greece, in California, etc. And also obviously the local context of Britain being extremely warm. And I think the crucial thing to this story is, you can't see it here, but down at where the story's been written, if you turn over onto page 2, within 3 or 4 paragraphs, the newspaper journalist who's writing this, Paul Sims, is quoting climate scientists saying that there's a climate change angle to this story, and we live within a globally changing climate. So that's quite significant. This is just some data. This is the latest data from the University of Colorado in Boulder, who track how the media around the world is covering climate change. So this is the UK, and this gives you a sense from 2000 to present day. And it's quite a crude measurement. All it's doing is it's measuring in these key newspapers listed below. It's measuring how many times the term climate change or global warming appears in the text within those articles. So it's using, I think, Factiva probably to do that. But what it does is it shows you the current trend, so the near record trend, and this is effectively characterized by the Greta Thunberg, climate, school strikes, Extinction Rebellion, etc., that we've seen over the last year to 18 months, but also the huge drop recently due to the COVID pandemic, attention being taken from the media. And I think Alexandra implied this right at the beginning when she was introducing that this has had a big impact. But you'll see some other key moments here. So this spike here is in 2016. And this is the Paris Agreement being signed, but also we have, and then the response to that, and then previously the 2009 Copenhagen Summit. So you can see that these key international moments are big drivers of media coverage. If I go on to another country, sorry, this is Spain. So this is Spanish newspapers, and this gives quite a similar, but noticeably different in certain areas angle. So you've again got the big spike for Greta Thunberg and all the protests of the last year or so. Again, a big decline for the COVID pandemic. But you've also got some other little things going on here. Like this little moment here is when Donald Trump announced that he wanted to pull the US out of the Paris Agreement. You've also got a very different characteristic in this time. So you've got the Copenhagen Summit here, but you've also got a moment here around 2007 and 8. And this is effectively the moment where Al Gore brought out his movie, An Inconvenient Truth, or a documentary, and it won a couple of Oscars. And you've also got the fourth assessment of the IPCC making headlines in Spain. If we go to a different country, this is Germany now. I mean, admittedly, they are only tracking 2 newspapers, so it's a limited bit of data. But it does show you quite a different picture within Germany. So again, we've got the recent spike, but there really isn't anything for a decade or so before then. And then you've got the Al Gore film and the IPCC reports around that time. You've got the Copenhagen Summit, but strikingly, the Paris Agreement doesn't really make that much of an impact. And to give you the fuller picture, this is all of the European newspapers from Ireland, Norway, you can see them listed down here, Spain, etc., all brought together into a broader data set. And again, we're seeing some of these similar moments. The data, I think, is a little bit warped by this line over here, which is effectively The Guardian being included, but it also includes Guardian Australia for a period of time. So I think you have to discount this little bit here a little bit, but it gives you a broad picture of what has happened in European peaks and troughs of coverage over that time. I just want to, for good contrast, to show you United States. So we've just seen Europe and some of the differences within Europe, but this is the United States. And we see actually a very different picture. We see a really growing trend. And actually, Donald Trump has really driven the coverage of climate change in the US. But there are obviously issues with that. And the fact that he characterizes a very partisan and skeptical take on climate change. And I think this is one of the key issues around reporting of climate change. And, I'll be interested in the Q&A after this to hear about any other regional or local perspectives on this. But certainly from my understanding and experience reporting on it in the UK, is that there has been this huge problem with what we call false balance from within journalism reporting this topic. The idea that we're all trained as journalists to give an equal and good sense of all sides of the story. But the problem with something like climate change and climate science is giving 50-50 coverage to, say, the climate scientist and then the person who's skeptical of the science for whatever reasons, ideological reasons, etc. Then that has really shifted and changed and warped the media coverage over time. I'm just aware of time, so I'm just going to skip on to part 2 of my talk, which is really to focus on what we do at Carbon Brief and why. So this is just a little animation showing you a key article that we published a good couple of years ago now, and it's been very, very popular for us. And effectively, it was almost like an academic exercise. We went through about 70 academic studies and pulled out all the key statistics from those studies, showing you what the impacts of global warming would be at different levels of temperature and across very different metrics. So we looked at crop yields, we looked at all sorts of things, the melting sea ice, And it effectively is a synthesis or a summary of scientific information, but done for a much more general audience than, say, than scientists themselves would do. And it had a very big impact, and it even got, you know, this is an example of Leonardo DiCaprio tweeting that article and spreading it to his audience and to his followers. And I think what it does is it shows that our form of journalism, which is quite long form, it's quite deep. We do a lot of data visualizations. We spend a lot of time on our journalism, and we don't do very much news journalism. In fact, we purposely stay back and away from what conventional news journalism, partly because we're a specialist website and we don't feel that there's much point competing with, say, Reuters and the BBC and the Washington Post and everyone else, because so many other people are at the front end of that and are doing that. Whereas we do feel there is an audience and a need, often amongst other journalists, to be honest, that other journalists are an important audience for us, to have very foundational articles which effectively explain, as I said before, explain climate change in a very neutral but detailed way to an audience of, our audience, as I said, includes journalists, but it also includes policymakers, other academics, NGOs, etc. This is another example of something that we do that's had a very big impact beyond our kind of specialist kind of orbit, if you like. So this is Greta herself tweeting an animation that we made back at the end of last year, which has had enormous reach because she's been, in fact, this weekend she tweeted it again in Swedish, and it's had another big boost. If you see down here, this animation, which I'll play you in a minute, has had, last count, has just on this tweet alone, has had 5.2 million views just due to Greta Thunberg tweeting it herself. If I hit play on here, you'll just get a sense of this. I can share, if anyone wants to email me afterwards, I can show you any of these links. But it's actually quite a simple plot. We're just plotting IPCC data and annotating it and explaining it. But for Greta and her audience, she felt that this was at a simple enough level for her audience to understand the consequences of not reducing global emissions in time. And she actually she DM'd us on Twitter and asked us for the video file so that she could post it on Instagram and everything. So, you know, we were, you know, delighted by that. But it's very interesting to see how people take our output and our published material and then use it for their own purposes. But we're not campaigners. We're not an NGO or whatever. We're just straight reporting what the science says in a hopefully communicable and easy to absorb and understand small little product like this, like an animation. This is, when we did that, we obviously played around with other things as well. And this is something we did, which is also very, very popular on Twitter, which is what we call the racing bar charts. And effectively, we were trying to answer a question which often gets asked about historic emissions and who's responsible for the historic emissions that are in the atmosphere right now. And then when we looked at the data, it was kind of fascinating to go back to 1750 and see who historically is responsible for the most emissions. So this, in a way, is making a very powerful political point, but it's effectively just an animation of raw data. And obviously, you just saw that the USA overtook the United Kingdom around the period of the First World War. And then the USA races away in terms of its cumulative emissions. But you'll see some other, if we let it play for a little bit, you'll see some other very fascinating things happening in the post-war period. So probably many of you are now looking at this thinking, where is China, for example? And if you look right down at the bottom of the screen, you can see China beginning to come up the chart. And we're still only in the coming up to 1980. And China is still just only overtaking France at that period. And you see the pace of China's emissions getting faster and faster. And it only overtakes the UK in 2000, which is kind of extraordinary. Not many people would assume that. But still far, far behind the USA. And look at the speed of China now. And this again is making a powerful political point. But even in 2018, China is way behind the USA in terms of cumulative emissions. So again, I guess another kind of fairly simple exercise, but making a quite powerful point that people wanted to share. And it helps to sort of get and disseminate our journalism. This is a quick example of something that we've done in this year around COVID, where we did some very quick analysis and it made headlines around the world when we did it. We were one of the first people to do some analysis to see the impact that the COVID lockdowns had had on global emissions. And then we also put it into some context. So we put it in context against what happened in the Second World War, the recession in the early 90s, you know, energy crisis, Spanish flu, and then the financial crisis of 10 years ago. So again, people like us as journalists putting these things in full context, they appreciate that and they like to share that. And yeah, I'm going to stop there because I wanted to open it out to questions. I can talk about any of those particular points, but if anyone's got a specific question around the first part of my talk around my own experience of reporting climate change over the last couple of decades, and then also about anything that we do at Carbon Brief in particular, I'd be very, very happy to answer. So I'll hand back to Alexandra.
Thank you very much, Leo. My first question would be on, I've noticed in your speech this term, false balance, you told. I haven't heard that expression before. We would rather be speaking on that balance is interpreted in a different way in science journalism. But how would you, so I mean, I understand what we're talking about, but how would you interpret this? How would you communicate this concept to your readers? Or if your readers are all, say, like a Greta Thunberg audience, so they understand, but how would you explain this idea, yes, so that I'm not giving you two sides, but I measure it to the readers who maybe are used to the classical approach, and then they say that you are pro, you know.
Well, it's a big topic, and it's a difficult one sometimes, both within journalism and also for the audience to fully understand. Because on a basic level, we as journalists, as I mentioned, we're all trained to give a fair and balanced reflection of the world that we're reporting, and to give a sense of proportionate viewpoints. And I think that's proportionality is where the key question comes in around false balance. So the example I gave, where a news report might report a new piece of science and it will quote the scientist who's the lead author of that paper. In the conventional classical model of journalism, you would then get someone who has an opposing view of that, and you'll give them some weighting as well. And you might also bring a third view in, a kind of counterbalance view. The problem obviously with that is that climate science fundamentally, the fundamentals of climate science have been, you know, in terms of the scientific consensus, have been agreed and pretty much locked down for 20, 30 years. It's obviously a new science in terms of reporting what the impacts are going to be and what the scenarios are around, but the fundamentals of climate change around are human caused emissions, are making the planet warm, have been uncontroversial scientifically for a long, long time. But if the media is looking, or a journalist is looking to provide balance around that issue, certainly I think it's got less in the last 5 years or so, but certainly as that front page I showed you from the Daily Express, only from 10 years ago, there are still some journalists who, either from that sort of classical training, or that they have an ideological position against climate change and the policy implications, their journalism gets warped, I think, and distorted as a result, because they can bring in a countering voice who is a skeptic of the science, who does not represent at all the scientific consensus, and therefore the article becomes a 50-50 debate, effectively, between the science. And our role at Carbon Brief is to effectively reflect and accurately report the science, nothing more. We don't have any policy position, we're policy neutral, we don't have a view about, you know, I don't know, nuclear energy, pro or anti or whatever. We're just reporting it straight down the middle. But to do that, we study the journals every day. We go through hundreds of papers every week looking at the latest climate science. So we're very, very on top of what the latest science is showing, as well as understanding what the historical canon of climate science, shows and says as well. And it would be wrong, I think, for us as journalists to write a piece about a new climate science paper, and then just because we think it needs a 50-50 balance, we bring in a doubting voice. But I think I come at it from a Anglo-centric view. So I come at it from a particularly British view, because we've had a big problem with climate skeptic distorting our politics and our media for a long time. And we've seen this in the US and we've seen it in Australia. But I appreciate, I've spoken to journalists in Brazil, in Germany, Italy, all over the world about this issue, India. And it's very striking how sometimes it really is not an issue at all within their local reporting kind of methodology. It's really fascinating to me, which suggests to me it's almost like a cultural or a national issue sometimes.
Thank you. We have an interesting question from Rosie Delone. A lot of measures brought in to protect against COVID are not environmentally friendly. What impact do you think this will have? And if large, how do you think this can be communicated? So I joined this question. Are face masks the new cigarette butts and plastic bottles?
Yeah, it's a really fascinating question. We're looking at it purely from an carbon emissions point of view. So we did that analysis earlier this year that showed that sure, there was a historic drop in global emissions, but that's expected to be very, very short term on a historical basis. In fact, arguably, it probably won't really make much of a difference in terms of the wider cumulative emissions that are going into the atmosphere all the time. A small percentage point or whatever. I think the bigger question is how the world now responds. So we've, since COVID started, since the last few months, our policy writers have been looking a lot at what's called the green recovery measures and policy measures being introduced around the world. So the idea that if we need to stimulate the economies around the world after the lockdowns, can we do so in a way that is not as polluting as we did, say, 10 years ago, where people just ramp up heavy industry, they burn more fossil fuels in the factories, etc., in an attempt to stimulate the economies. This is, I think, to me, one of the most fascinating areas of our response to COVID is can we make different decisions now and lifestyle changes and business practices. So we've already seen aviation and tourism, for example, really, really dropping off, and we're holding this conference now pretty much virtually. So whereas, a year ago, we might have all been in Trieste all together or talking together, which is sad that we're not doing that, but it's also interesting environmentally that we're not doing that, because it has a very different footprint as a result. Well, and a lot of people home working, different decisions being made around business practices, etc. So I think this is a really, really fascinating. I think the next year to 2 years are going to be really, really crucial. And I think there's a big job for reporters and journalists to really explain and report that, because we could have a fundamental shift in terms of the economic drivers that have previously forced some of the polluting behavior around our choices. We have an opportunity, really. We can be positive that this could be an opportunity to change the ways. But I think all eyes are on countries like China and India, particularly some of the really big emitting countries. And the decisions they make over the next 12 months or so are going to be really, really significant. But I think the temporary drop in global emissions is not particularly significant for climate change generally.
Thank you. James Stacy asks about the content of your portal. Do you see your content as snapshots in time or live objects that you update as new studies and data become available?
As I think I understood the question, I think all the journalism we do, as I mentioned at the beginning, we don't really do news journalism. So we don't do partly because we invest a lot of time and effort to do our articles and research them and things. We don't want it to have a shelf life of, say, 4 hours. It's not like a Reuters Newswire story where, you know, you write it and it's, you know, you do 300 words and it has a shelf life or a moment of interest for about, you know, 6 hours, 12 hours, 24 hours, or whatever. We want our journalism to be searchable online so that people can find it and we can continue to re-promote it. So we're trying to do a lot of foundational explainer journalism that is kind of timeless. Sure, we do often go back into our articles and update them and we add new information. But fundamentally, we want the article to be usable and shareable for, I don't know, let's say 2 or 3 years after it's been published, perhaps.
Thank you. I would do a concluding question from Ben Dayton. How is Carbon Brief funded? What is the business model or that publication like yours?
Yeah, I'm really pleased that question's come up because I think it's a really important one for journalism right now because we're under a lot of stress as a business model. You know, we're all suffering in terms of advertising revenues, et cetera, et cetera. We all know the story. So we are hopefully a really positive case study of where journalism or how journalism could be potentially funded in the future. So we are funded via a philanthropic foundation, and we have been for 10 years since we launched, called the European Climate Foundation. And we get an annual grant from them. And to be honest, it's a wonderful relationship because we speak to them effectively once a year, say what money we need for the next year. They either agree or don't agree. They've always agreed. And then they send us the money and then we speak to them a year later. So they have no editorial influence or control over what we write. And that was, when I took over Carbon Brief 5 years ago, I said that was a total, you know, red line for me. That was very important that we had our editorial independence. And they understand that because they appreciate that if we don't have that, no one is going to trust or find our journalism authoritative. So they understand that, we understand that. And actually, I hope that we're a very good case study of how this new form of funding journalism can be used in other sectors, not just, you know, what we're doing now, but in health journalism, other forms of science journalism, other forms of journalism, full stop. Because I think there is a widespread recognition now that the existing business models, either subscription, paywalls, advertising, whatever, classified, whatever, they're all really, really suffering, particularly now and during the pandemic. So finding new forms of funding journalism is vital, and I think hopefully we've got an example of that.
We will have later today a session exactly on one of the new ways of funding journalism. So thank you very much, Leo. Thank you very much, everyone, for your activity, for your questions. Unfortunately, we cannot take all of them right now. What I suggest is maybe if Leo has some time, he can remain and answer in typing. Otherwise, I remind everyone that we are on Twitter and most of our speakers are also there. So you can continue conversation there. And yeah, it's great to have so many questions. I would love to conclude with this reflection that we're not together, and this is sad, but we have a little bit less of carbon emission due to this, and this is nice. And maybe in the future, say one of the take-home messages from the pandemic will be in the future that this would be an issue of choice. So I hope all the future conferences, and I can say this, I think, in quite being sure that at least conferences of science journalists would definitely be much more online than before, so that if you choose to travel, you travel, but if you choose for any reason to stay, you still can be connected, you still can talk and ask and listen. This is what we are doing now, and I think this is great anyway. Thank you very much, Leo.
Thank you.